Vielleicht erkennst du jetzt, dass Gott uns dazu einlädt, sehr vorsichtig mit dem Thema Schulden umzugehen. Aber das ist eine Sache, etwas zu wissen, eine andere Sache, etwas umzusetzen. Besonders, wenn man schon vielleicht in Schulden steckt. Wie kann man da weiterkommen? Was sind praktische Tipps dazu? Ich bin auch dankbar, dass hierzu auch Larry ein paar Gedanken hattest. Und ich bete wirklich, dass sie dir helfen werden, gesunden Schritten zu machen in deiner Finanzverwaltung mit Gott.
Well, first of all, let me talk a little bit about the issue of bad debt. Typically, I think it's very risky to use credit cards to spend too much. You can use a credit card as long as you pay it off every month. But if you look at a credit card interest rate and you can't pay it off every month, it may cost up to 20% or more in interest. And it's not wise to use credit card debt to increase your standard of living when you can't afford to pay it off. If you pay it off every month, that's not a problem. I think the biggest problem with bad debt is when you go into debt and you can't pay it off. It's easy to go into debt, but it's difficult to pay it off. One of the areas that I counsel students particularly is if they go to college or go to seminary or study in Bible Institute, if they take on a lot of debt, it's very difficult to pay it off after they get out. Particularly if they get a degree from seminary and they take a job as a pastor at $40,000, and if they have debt of $80,000, the chances are they probably won't be in ministry, full-time ministry, 5 years later, because they just can't pay off that amount with the amount that they take. So we're constantly trying to evaluate how much to take on as debt versus how much we can pay it off. Now, good debt there's a principle in business called leverage that I mentioned briefly in the last session. And the concept of leverage is really quite simple. And I'm going to use an example of a house. If you buy a house for $100,000 and you put down $20,000 in equity and you get a loan for the remainder at say 7%, you make those payments. Typically, in many areas of the world, houses will double in 10-year period. Well, if you take and double the value of that house at $100,000, it's now $200,000, but your equity has gone from $20,000 to $120,000. That's leverage. And that, in my view, is good debt. And it's a principle we can use also in our giving in building God's kingdom. So it's one of the things we need to think about when we go to take out loans and take out debt. Is it good debt? Is it effective debt? Or is it not? And to say that we don't need any debt, I think is maybe not wise. But we have to be extremely careful of where we manage the money and where we spend it. I think debt is a very difficult area to deal with. I have counseled some people that have 100% of their credit card limit in debt, and they can't get out of it. They end up paying the base interest and maybe a little bit of the principal, and then they go out and spend some more money. They just can't get out of it. And every month that debt has to be paid. One of the points that Proverbs makes, or the book of Proverbs makes, is that when you are in debt with someone else, the lender becomes your master. And it's very difficult when you're in a situation where you can't pay off the debt, because that person has the ability to come in and make life very uncomfortable. I think the best way to get out of debt is to keep track of all the expenditures, and it's very difficult to do because there's always money that is spent without anticipation, where a check is not written or a credit card is not used. But the main thing is to keep track of every detail as much as you possibly can. There's some excellent tools out today that allow for money management. Quicken is a good example. We happen to use QuickBooks. There are many others that are very effective. Even Excel spreadsheets can work. So keeping track of those details is really important. I spoke with a good friend of mine who was an accountant, and he had been involved with several cases of bankruptcy. And he said he had never been involved in a bankruptcy case where the people who took out bankruptcy knew what their expenses were. It's an amazing statement by a full-time auditor. Because when you know where your expenses go, then you're able to try to manage it. If you don't know where your expenses go, all of a sudden you end up and there's no money left. It's always a good question to say, well, what do you do about tithing? In my view, tithing is the first thing that's done. As soon as the money comes in, it's the first thing. The Old Testament talks about giving the first fruits. If you think about that, they were not to give a lamb that was injured. They were to give the best lamb. And that was the sacrifice. And I think that's the same principle we need to apply in our lives, is when we receive funds, we give it first, and then God blesses the rest. But in getting out of debt means that we have to be very disciplined to do that.